Vista, decks are able to find their snow basics very easily to enable common. Due to all of these upsides, On Thin Ice was a pretty common removal spell for snow decks in modern and supply lines as well. However, On Thin Ice has fallen out of favor recently. The banning of Arcum's Astrolabe made snow decks a lot less popular, which really hurts the card's viability a lot. On top of that, there are other removal spells like Prismatic Ending that are easier to play and don't have the downside of letting your opponent get their card back if they beat the champ. The release of these stronger removal spells have kind of pushed On Thin Ice out of the format, so On Thin Ice isn't really seeing too much in modern right now. But if it were legal in weaker formats like Pioneer, it would probably be seen full then. Speaking of Pioneer, we should mention Thin Ice's older brother, Champion of Rocks. This is a very similar card that leads to Enchanted Mountain rather than Snowland. This card is legal in Pioneer and is seen pretty consistently in decks like Forest Aggro and Flyers of Convention decks. Champ is definitely the weaker card, but it's actually seeing more play right now due to the format is legal. Thin Ice and Chain do a great job of showing the strength and weaknesses of cards. They're really strong and efficient cards, but the downside is attached to it and having a high blow-up potential, which is true of pretty much all of the cards. In another country, we have Threads of Disloyalty. This is an enchantment aura with a mana cost of 1 and 2 blue. It has Enchant Creature with mana value 2 or less, and the ability where you control the enchanted creature. This is a part of a larger genre of auras that all let you gain control of the creature, so Threads will be the most having control of creatures with mana value 2 or less may seem a little different, but they are actually a good target. For the longest time, Tom Wood was one of the scariest as modern, and Threads cannot only deal with it, but also a card advantage because your opponent. Now, this is all really good because the card of one Threads has historically seen some pretty heavy threads like modern. However, the card has fallen off pretty hard and only sees very niche play in modern nowadays. So, what caused this card to fall off? Well, first of all, the format is fantastic. Paying 3 mana for a card that is a source of Now, this is always possible, but as the format is set up, the blow-up comes first, so you have more and more lead to lose outright if your opponent has the answers to the threats. The final nail in the coffin, though, was Archmage's Charm. This is an instant that costs 3 blue mana and lets you choose one of 3 modes. Draw 2 cards, count a target spell, or gain control of a non-land permanent with mana value 1 or less. Charm has a few upsides over Threads that overweigh its downsides heavily. Not being able to target mana value 2 creatures still include a large variety of really important threats. On top of that, the instant speed and the fact that your opponent can't use removal spell to get their creature back made it a way safer card to use. This isn't even mentioning the other 2 modes which are used all the time as well. Ultimately, there's very little reason to run Threads now that Archmage's Charm is in the format. Still, the card remains a relatively niche tech option that decks will play sometimes, so despite the card being a card, it still slides into this list. Next up at number 8, we have Ensoul Artifact. This is an enchantment aura with a mana cost of 2. It has Enchant Artifact and the ability where the artifact it's attached to is a 5/5 creature in addition to its own turns. Ensoul Artifact in turn the artifact is even better, if the artifact is attached to the turn, play because it can be summoned. There are tons of really transfers. For one, attached to the Dark Steel Citadel will give you a 5/5 destructible, making it a 1/1. One application is attached to the artifact creatures. This will overwrite the creature's natural stats and turn it into a 1/5, making Ensoul Artifact a substantial upgrade to a creature's natural stats. Attaching it to a card like Ornithopter gives you a 5/5 flying. Attach it to a Stone Coil Serpent will give you 5/5 plus counters where Regalia will give you a creature that will still have the Serpent's abilities. This will usually give you at least a 6/6 in trample, meaning it can deal excess combat damage to your opponent, reach, meaning it can block 3 creatures, and protection multicolor, meaning it can block targeted, deal damage, or enchanted by anything that's more than color. Now, these are just a few of the great targets for Ensoul Artifact, but if we're going over every good target for it, we'd be really good. Ensoul Artifact has been the backbone aggro that has been here for quite some time now. In 2015, Ensoul Artifact was a great standard deck, taking more than 5 The deck hasn't seen quite so much success in a year, but it still has more than respectable results. Despite its strength and artifact aggro decks being a previous artifact legacy, Insult Artifact doesn't see much play any further back than Pioneer. This is mostly due just to there being better cards and strategies for these kinds of decks past Pioneer. And at number 7, we have enchanted creature gets +3/+3 and gains first strike, meaning it deals combat damage before creatures without first strike. Lifelink, meaning it dealing damage without you gain average life, and Vigilance, meaning it doesn't have to tap to attack. This is a ridiculous rate for an aura, but it is a bit scary to use. Throwing 2 separate auras onto a creature and losing that much hard damage on single interaction is far away from the game. However, it is a bit competitive. Hexproof. Hexproof is an ability that makes it so your opponent can't target you if permanent has hexproof with their spells or abilities. Since most forms removal require targeting, this will make it nearly impossible for your opponent to deal with your creature. Even better, there are 1-mana creatures with hexproof, namely Slippery Bogle and Golden Beast. Requiring very specific types of removal, such as Edicts and Lord Plays. Daybreak Coronet really shines in this deck. Its combination of a huge stat boost and a swarm of keywords makes the deck really hard to deal with. You have to race them because you can't kill the creature, but Lifelink lets them gain too much life, and Vigilance means they can keep attacking you without leaving themselves open. First Strike is the final making it really hard to beat the creature in combat. Daybreak Coronet is a great addition to both these decks, but there are a few more auras that are also played in those decks that are just a bit stronger. And at number 6, we have Ethereal Armor. This is an enchanted aura with the mana cost of 1 white. It has Enchant Creature and the ability where the enchanted creature gets +1/+1 for each enchantment you control and has first strike. This is another card that seems to be good play in all these decks. However, this card has also seen some more success in other decks, where Daybreak Coronet is Ethereal Armor has been combined with Hexproof creatures in its run through Standard and Pioneer. In those formats, it's seen play alongside Blade Cover Scout and Bassar Town Archer, 2 cheap, efficient, and expert creatures. However, the card has also seen play as a deck built around a full Eidolon, a 1/2 enchantment creature with lifelink and the ability where, whenever a creature dies, you draw a card for each aura you control that is attached to it. This does a lot to offset the inherent disadvantage of getting your single creature killed. However, having a hexproof creature does that as well as protect your creatures from being in the first place, making it a generic visual combo. Now, both Ethereal Armor and Daybreak Coronet are really great cards for the other side decks, but neither of them have really seen play inside of these decks, so it's kind of hard to place one of them together. Ultimately, Armor is taking the spot of Coronet because it's seen a little success outside of these cards. And another card, we have Rancor. This is an enchantment aura with a mana cost of 3. It has Enchant Creature, the abilities where the enchanted creature gets +2/+0 and trample, and whenever it's put from your graveyard, you return it to your hand. The ability to return itself back to your hand is a great effect that helps balance out the downsides of auras, not to mention it's already a good rate for the dark. Trample is a really nice ability to give a creature in any way, because one of the best ways to stall for time against aggro is to simply Trample and get through your damage, which can really help creature-based aggro decks close the game. Rancor is kind of a staple of creature-based aggro decks, at least in formats where it's legal. Unfortunately, there just aren't all that many creature-based aggro decks. As a result, this card has been somewhat outside. For the cards, option for green decks, seems like occasional play alongside the format's powerful cheap threats. This is a huge accomplishment. The fact that Rancor is strong enough to see play the way it was intended to be played, and how strong its focus is extremely impressive. Legacy has multiple combinations. It's a very powerful format, and carving out a niche in such a powerful metagame is more than what the deck is list. And at number 4, we have Spreading Seas. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 1/1 blue. It has Enchant Land, and it has the abilities where when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, and whatever land it's enchanting is an island. Now, anyone who's familiar with Blood Moon will be able to tell at a glance why this card is good. But for everyone else, we need to quickly cover how this card works. You see, when it turns a land into an island, that land loses all of its other abilities. This means that if the land used to be able to tap for any color of mana, now it can only tap for blue. This makes the card a really good way to mess with your opponent's mana, as well as mess with any other land's abilities that might be problematic. There are tons of lands with good abilities outside of making mana, and having a way to shut them off that also cycles is really nice. There are also a few really important applications of the card. You see, one really popular deck in Modern is Tron, a deck that's built around the Tron lands: Urza's Tower, Urza's Mine, and Urza's Power Plant. If you have all three of these lands out, they tap for extra mana. Mine and Plant each tap for 2 colorless, and Tower taps for an impressive 3 mana. This can let players slam huge threats into play way too early. Combating these decks is something most modern players are thinking of when they build their deck, and Spreading Seas will basically remove one of these from play, as it takes away the land types, which is what the effects check for. Making your opponent lands islands have another upside. It makes them vulnerable to islands walk, an ability that makes the creature unable to be blocked if your opponent has an island. Since Merfolk's Lords also give the creature's island walk in addition to that boost, Spreading Seas has seen consistent play in that deck for years. Now, while the card is good and sees a lot of play in Modern, it doesn't really see play in Legacy. This is mostly because there are just better options, such as Wasteland, a land that you can sacrifice to destroy a non-basic land. So, Spreading Seas' success is limited in Modern, because older formats have better options. And at number 3, we have Utopia Sprawl. This is an enchantment aura with a mana cost of 1 green. It has Enchant Forest, and it has abilities where, as it enters the battlefield, you choose a color, then whenever the enchanted land is tapped for mana, you add 1 mana of the chosen color. Also, it's worth mentioning you don't need to put Sprawl on a basic forest. You can also put on any land that has the forest type, such as Stomping Grounds. Anyways, this is a great ramp spell that sees fairly common play modern decks that are interested in ramping aggressively. Now, you may wonder if this card is better than a card like Noble Hierarch or any other good mana decks. The thing is, this card can actually let you get 4 mana on your second turn, alongside a card named Arbor Elf. This is a 1 mana creature with the ability where you can tap it to untap a forest. So what you would do is play Arbor Elf on turn 1, on the next turn you play a land, cast your Sprawl on an untapped forest, and then use Arbor Elf to use it again to make 4 mana. This is the only way to make 4 mana on your second turn outside of things like rituals, but these cause you to lose card advantage and only make red mana. This interaction has become the backbone of an entire genre of decks in Modern, as tons of green mid-range decks have used these cards to accelerate into strong turn 2 plays. Historically, this was used in Ponza decks, decks focused on using land destruction. These decks would accelerate into Acid Moss on turn 2, a spell that destroys a land and ramps a forest out, putting them extremely far ahead of their opponent in terms of mana. Nowadays, people play a few less land destruction cards and a few more big threats, though the general principle of the deck remains the same. Outside of Modern, Sprawl sees occasional play in Legacy and Enchantress decks. The Enchantress are a group of cards that draw you a card whenever you cast enchantment spell. In decks like these, cards like Sprawl can be a card neutral and mana neutral play, as you don't lose mana if you can tap the land you put the Sprawl on that turn, and if you have an Enchantress out, you get your card back. This is really strong, as you're ramping without really giving anything up that turn. We should mention cards like Wild Growth, which is a very similar card that isn't legal in Modern. We went with Sprawl because of the color fixing it provides and the fact that it's able to be played in Modern, so it's the card people see more often. And at number 2, we have Splinter Twin. This is an enchantment aura with a mana cost of 2 and 2 red. It has Enchant Creature, and it has the ability where the enchanted creature gains the ability to tap it to create a token that's a copy of that creature. The token gains haste, meaning it can attack and activate its tap abilities that turn. And finally, you have to exile at the beginning of your next end step. People probably expected to see this card somewhere on this list. This card has some obvious shenanigans with cards that have enter the battlefield triggers. However, the best way to use it is with cards like Pestermite, which can tap or untap a permanent when they enter the battlefield. So, if you have the Twin on Pestermite, and you activate the Twin ability, you'll make a hasty Pestermite and get its enter the battlefield ability to tap or untap anything. With that trigger, you can untap the original Pestermite, letting you activate the copying ability again. Now, there's nothing stopping you from doing this loop over and over, so you can simply repeat it until you have enough Pestermites with haste to kill your opponent right there. Even better, because Pestermite has flash, meaning you can cast it at instant speed. You could hold up your mana on turn 3 to see if your opponent is doing anything that could kill you, and if they don't, cast it during their end step. Then, on your next turn, you can cast your Twin to combo off. This interaction was the backbone of an aptly named Twin decks in Modern up until the card was banned from the format. Now, Twin isn't seen play in any older formats, as there are better combos to be pulling off. But if the card ever did come off the Modern ban list, it would still be a viable deck. I don't think there's any other aura that's had this big of an impact on the format, but there is one aura that's still more powerful. And all the way at number 1, we have Animate Dead. This is an enchantment aura with a mana cost of 1 and 1 black. Now, this card is a bit old, so the way it works is a little weird. But basically what it does is you put it on a creature in your graveyard. You put that creature onto the battlefield under your control and attach Animate Dead to it. That creature gets -1, -0, and whenever Animate Dead leaves the battlefield, you sacrifice that creature. It's worded in a bit of a more complex way, but that's to make sure that it works within the game's rules. This is the gist of how the card works without all the bells and whistles. Anyway, paying 2 mana to get a creature card from your graveyard back, with only the small downside of giving it a -1 power and making it easier to remove, makes Animate Dead the second best reanimation spell in the entire game. The only better reanimation spell is, well, Animate, which is a 1-mana sorcery that returns any creature from the graveyard to your side of the field and makes you lose life equal to the mana. Despite there being a better version of this effect, that hasn't stopped Animate Dead from seeing heavy play. The Animated Dead card is happy to run 4 copies of reanimation cards. Running 4 copies of both cards alongside another 4 copies of Zoom, another great 2 mana. There is another card with a similar effect, the Animated Dead, but these have the downside your untapped step, and you have to pay 1 and 1 black on your upkeep to tap it. Since this is a bigger damage than giving a creature this -0, Animate Dead sees far more play. Now, having Animate Dead on your creature is the extreme downside, but there are ways to turn it into an upside. World Gorger Dragon is a strange card with the abilities where, when it enters the battlefield, you exile all of the cards you control, and when it leaves the battlefield, you return those exile cards to your fold. So, if you bring it back with Animate Dead, you will exile Animate Dead with its enter the battlefield trigger. And then Animate Dead will make you sacrifice it as it's on the battlefield. That will trigger its ability to return the exile cards to the field, which will bring back Animate Dead into your field. Or will come This combo shows up in Legacy once in a while, but isn't necessarily a staple because bringing back Crystal Brain is usually not Animate Dead is only usable in Legacy Vintage, which is good. The fact that the card is way too good in the other format kind of shows why the ones Alright, that's the list. Are there any other cards you can put in this list? Or have any ideas for future videos using this one? If so, this means that there are some cards that are staples in the format that are actually fairly weak in every other format. So today we're going over cards that change the most between Commander and Major formats. One thing before we start, cards that specifically refer to things like opponents will be excluded in order to make a list of creatures. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 with the effect 3 counter target enchantment instant or sorcery spell, and then this spell will upgrade to creature token of color. This card is extremely efficient, but the downside of giving your opponent HM2 is a cost, or at least it is in most of the formats. In Commander, where you start with 4 life, it basically gives you one deals to you. This is such a small cost. The downside of the card is only being able to counter all cards. Luckily, the selection includes some very important card types. Enchantments are alright, but the really important card types are instants and sorceries. There are tons of really powerful instants and sorceries that are in the deck to want to play. Most importantly, most forms of interaction are instants and sorceries. This makes Swansong not only a pretty good counter spell for stopping your opponent's plays, but also an amazing spell for protecting your own. It's no wonder that so many So, why is it back into the formats? Song is held back into the formats by a combination of the downside of the creature being worse and there being better options. You see, because of the fact that Commander uses the plus 1, you have to run 1 copy of the best 8 versions of the effect, rather than being able to run 1 copy of counter spells, Cluster Storm, like most of the decks usually do, blue decks that want to run lots of counter spells have to run 1 copy of Force, 1 copy of Cluster, and eventually rather quickly run on a list of best counter spells to Swansong. Now, the reason why Swansong isn't that high on this list is that it has seen competitive success in other formats, though far, far less than it has in Commander. So it only breaks the top part of this list because it's a card that's good in other formats that's great in Commander, whereas other cards in this list are bad in most of the formats in BO3. And at number 9, we have Sanctum Revolver. This is a legendary enchantment shrine with a mana cost of 1 white, blue, 1 black, 1 red, and 1 green. It has the abilities where, at the beginning of your upkeep, you find a shrine card from your deck or graveyard and put it to the battlefield. It also has the ability where, if an ability of a shrine you control a trigger and you control 6 of the shrines, it triggers an additional time. Shrines, for anyone who doesn't know, are a small archetype of enchantment protected by the They each have abilities that scale the number of cards you have. For example, Odin of Infinite Rage is a legendary shrine that costs 2 red. At the beginning of your upkeep, it deals 1 damage per target for each shrine you control. Each of the other shrines has the same ability. This is a pretty great payoff for shrines, but this is still one of the actual combo decks. It controls that, so Commander, this plan is a lot easier than two other types of decks. It's really hard to blitz down on your players, or to grind a card advantage when your opponent draws 3 cards every turn you move 1. However, that's an issue. Other combo decks can easily unlock shrines, but now that you don't have to worry about as many aggro control decks, shrine decks can focus more of their resources on playing more interactions to stop these decks from comboing off. And at number 8, we have Fist of the Suns. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 3, and the ability where you pay 1 mana. So, for example, if you wanted to cast a spell like Omniscience, which normally would cost 7 and 3 blue, you can blue, 1 black, 1 red, green, paying a total of only 5 mana, getting quite the discount. Now, this card is usually pretty bad. It still costs 8 mana to cast your deck cards, and if they Breach, an instant that costs 4 and 1 red that lets you put a creature from your hand to the battlefield and use it haste. A keyword that lets it attack that turn, but you have to sacrifice it at the end of the turn. So, for less mana, because you don't have to pay 3 on an earlier turn, and a less specific cost of mana, you can also cheat out every threat and get to attack with it right away. Fist has a few upsides over the Breach as well. It can let you pay 5 to cast a card from anywhere, not just your hand, so it can work on cards and zones that the Breach can't. It also sticks around and lets you use its ability again, and can work on cards and other creatures. However, the Breach is usually a card with 60 options. Usually only need 1 turn to win with whatever you choose to play, as you're probably cheating something like Everpool, which will force your opponent to sacrifice 6 permanents when he attacks. Since most cards will be cheating out at the start of the game, you only really need 1 turn with them to win. It's also much easier to use in most formats. Paying 3 mana followed by 1 mana each color is so hard to get together, especially compared to 4. Because of these upsides, no one has ever played Fist over commons. Not to mention that the Breach isn't seen played by anyway, as it's not quite good enough. However, in Commander, Fist upsides matter a lot more. A single turn with a card like Everpool isn't enough to win a game in Commander, and you have 3 opponents you can kill. Though technically Everpool is an animal. Another upside is the ability to use the effect multiple times. As you want to kill multiple opponents, you'll want multiple big threats on the board. However, one of the best upsides is that you can use it to do things like cast your commander from each color, whereas the doesn't do anything, because your commander isn't technically a if the commander is a card, like the Dragon, a massive creature that costs, this will give you a permanent format discount each time you have to cast it. A huge discount is really strong, where you need to deal so much damage to so many lands. Fist of the Suns is one of those cards that's usually a win more card in those formats, but in Commander, you need to win more. And at number 7, we have Arcane Denial. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 in blue, with the effect where you counter target spell, then at the beginning of the turns up, or that spell's controller costs 2. Arcane Denial is usually good, as it's a shrink minus 1. It's a great awful counter spell, job while being card neutral. There's not much of a reason to play Denial over the other counter spells. However, this is harder to use so if you use a counter spell like this card, because you're only going -1 against one opponent instead of two. This means that Arcane Denial, in terms of card advantage, is basically the same as playing a normal counterspell, depending on how you want to count card advantage in the multiplayer format. However, there are still some downsides. Giving one of your opponent's 2 cards can be a big boost, and can sometimes backfire, because sometimes it will give the cards and win the game. Arcane Denial is a staple counterspell and sees tons of play in the format. Comparing that to a basically zero play anywhere else, and you have a card that easily slides into this list. And at number 6, we have Torment of Hailfire. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of X, meaning any amount of mana, and 2 black. It has the effect where you repeat the following X times. Each opponent loses 3 life unless they discard a card or sacrifice a non-permanent. This card can easily be a game winner if you have enough mana to pump into it. However, this usually isn't feasible in most 60-card formats. There definitely are ways to make a lot of mana, but it's usually better to spend this mana on something else. As if you're going to spend 8 mana on something, it's probably better to play something like an Artifact of Cruelty, rather than make your opponent pitch some cards to this to stay alive. However, in Commander, the slower games let people make a ton of mana. Usually, people will use cards like the Vault Coffers, a land that lets you pay 2 and tap it to add 1 black for each swamp you control. Combine it with Urborg, which makes all land swamps in addition to their other types, and this can basically add 1 black for each land you control. Combining it with some black's other mana doublers, such as your Common Resident, which adds an additional black mana each time you tap a swamp for mana. Combining these cards together, you can make huge amounts of mana really easily. For example, with these 3 cards and a total of 8 lands, you can cast a Torment of Hailfire for X equals 19, which will do so much damage and make your opponent sacrifice so many cards and discard so much that it will usually end the game. This isn't viable in other formats for a few reasons. First off, a higher life totals means that games go longer, letting you get more lands more easily. Secondly, mana doublers are very scary, and players will usually try to remove them on sight. However, in Commander, where there are 4 players all playing scary cards and using their removal on different threats, the likelihood of any one threat sticking rises. This makes these sort of big mana combos more likely. The reason cards like Torment are nice is that they can always make use of all of your mana, whereas other threats like Arcane can leave you with unspent mana and not quite close the game for you. It's also worth mentioning Villainous Wealth, a sorcerer that costs X, 1 black, 1 green, and 1 blue, and lets you exile the top X cards in your library and cast any number of those cards that cost X or less without paying your mana costs. The story with Villainous Wealth is about the same as with Torment, but being more colors makes it less of a staple, whereas Torment can see play in any black deck. And at number 5, we have Triumph of the Hordes. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 2 and 2 green with the effect where until the end of the turn, each creature you control gets +1/+1 and gains trample, meaning excess combat damage is dealt to the defending player, and infect, meaning they deal damage in the form of -1/-1 counters to creatures and poison counters to players. And in case someone doesn't know, if a player ever has 10 or more poison counters, they lose the game. Triumph seems like a great way for a creature deck to end the game, but it hasn't been successful anywhere outside of Commander. You see, Triumph doesn't really fit in anywhere. In a non-infect deck, unless you manage to push for lethal the turn to cast it, all the damage is basically wasted. If you lower your opponent's life total with attacks beforehand, this won't help you kill them with poison. However, in a dedicated infect deck, Triumph's effect to give your creatures with infect an additional instance of infect is entirely redundant. Infect decks would rather just play normal pump spells that give bigger bonuses. Since dealing 10 damage to your opponent in a single combat step is usually too difficult, the Triumph doesn't really work in most formats. In Commander, however, it looks much better. Normally to win the game, you have to deal 120 damage to all 3 of your opponents. Triumph cuts that number down to 30, a much more manageable amount. Secondly, creature-based decks are more likely to develop a big board, as board stalls are far more common in the format. This means that Triumph slots into the format much better, and is capable of ending games far more often. Sure, you still have the problem of 2 of your types of damage not working together, but since you can get a bigger board more easily, and since it essentially quadruples your damage to players, this doesn't matter. There's only one card that ends games in Commander the way Triumph does, and that's Cater Hoof Behemoth. This is a giant creature that gives all of your creatures +X/+X until the end of the turn when it enters the battlefield, where X is the number of creatures you control. This is even stronger than Triumph on some board states, but Cater Hoof is actually really good in a number of formats outside of Commander, so it wasn't eligible for this list. And at number 4, we have Rhystic Study. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 2 and 1 blue, with the ability where whenever an opponent casts a spell, you may draw 1 card unless your opponent pays 1. I feel like a lot of people saw this one coming. Rhystic Study is a famously good Commander staple that's pretty easy to understand why it's not as good in other formats. In most formats, Rhystic Study asks you to pay 3 mana for what's basically a worse version of Sphere of Resistance. Sphere is a 2-mana artifact that makes it so all spells cost 1 more to cast. This means the effect isn't one-sided, like Ristic Studies is, but it has 2 huge advantages over Study. First off, the mana cost is way easier to work with. Not only does it cost less mana, it costs generic mana. This means you can cast something like Ancient Tomb, which is a land that lets you tap it for 2 colorless and take 2 damage. So if you want to tax your opponent, there are cards that outclass them. However, there's one other big advantage that cards like Sphere have over Study. Your opponent doesn't get to choose which effects you get. These cards that let your opponent choose what detrimental effect to deal with, called Punisher effects by the community, have to be way above rate to see any play. Your opponent can choose whatever effect hurts the least at any time. So if your opponent can afford to pay the mana, they'll do that. And if they can afford to give you cards, they'll do that instead. In Commander, the card is a lot better. The thing is, the card scales with extra opponents really well. The more opponents you have, the more spells Ristic Study will trigger on, and the more times your opponent will be forced to not pay the 1 and give you an extra card. This means that Ristic Study will draw you 3 times the amount of cards it normally would, and the extra draw really matters. Combine that with longer game length, and you get a card that goes from drawing you 1 or 2 cards a game to drawing you 10 cards a game. All of this together makes Study one of the best draw spells in the entire format. We should quickly mention Mystic Remora, a similar enchantment that costs 1 blue and has a cumulative upkeep of 1, which means every turn you put a time counter on it and then have to pay 1 for each time counter on it or sacrifice it. And whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, you draw a card unless they pay 4. This card is arguably better than Study, but it sees quite a bit of late vintage, so it was too successful in other formats to qualify for this list. And at number 3, we have Temur Sabertooth. This is a 4/3 cat with a mana cost of 2 and 2 green, with the ability where you can pay 1 and 1 green, and then you can return another creature control to its owner's hand, and if you do, it gains indestructible until the end of the turn. This ability is almost never worth it, as bouncing a creature back to your hand to save before 3 is way too high of a cost. You can use it to bounce another creature in response to a removal spell, but that's still not amazing. 4 mana for a badly stated creature that lets you pay more mana in the future to dodge some removal is just too expensive. However, there are ways to make use of Sabertooth. You see, if you have a card like Muldrifter, which allows you to draw 2 cards when it enters the battlefield, you can use Sabertooth to return it to your hand just so that you can play it again to draw even more cards. However, this is usually kind of unnecessary. Cards like Ghostly Flicker, which allow you to exile cards and then return them to the middle right away, this saves you the trouble of having to pay the Muldrifter's mana cost again. The upside of Sabertooth over these effects is that you can do it as many times as you have the mana for, but this is usually too slow and kind of a weak strategy. However, in Commander, its use cases go way in. There are a few legendary creatures that allow you to untap all of your lands, such as Zakama, which untaps all of your lands whenever it enters the battlefield if you cast it. So, if you have 12 lands on the battlefield, or lands that can tap for 12 mana with Cycle of Growth, you can tap all of your lands for 12 mana, cast Zakama, using 9 mana, leaving you with 3 floating and untap all of your lands. You can then activate Sabertooth to bounce it back to your hand, leaving 1 floating mana and all of your lands untapped. Each time you do this, you'll net 1 mana, meaning you can make infinite mana. And since Zakama has 3 separate mana sinks on it, you can probably win the game right there. This can get into similar loops with cards like Intruder Alarm, a card that untaps all creatures whenever a creature enters the battlefield, and creatures that tap for mana. The need for higher power combos and slower game speeds makes Sabertooth a real option for decks that want to repeat enter battlefield triggers, and these game-ending combos are practical thing. And at number 2, we have Teferi's Protection. This is an instant with a mana cost of 2 and 1/1. It has the effect where, until your next turn, your life total can't change and you gain protection from everything, which means nothing can damage, target, or be attached to you. Also, all your permanents phase out, which means they're treated as if they don't exist and face back in before you untap on your next turn. Then you exile Teferi's Protection. Teferi's Protection is basically a mix of Fog and a protection spell, which unfortunately isn't all that great. In most formats, Fogs are very bad. Simply stopping yourself from taking any damage for a turn doesn't really accomplish much. You go down 1 card, but your opponent hasn't done at all, and can just kill you again. Now, Protection does have the ability to protect you from combos that will kill you, not just from combat, but this isn't all that good either. If you want to stop your opponent from comboing off, there's almost always a better card for the jump. Normal interaction like counter spells, discard spells, or simple removal will usually do better. The ability to protect your board is better, but not enough. Protecting your entire board from a wrath can be strong, but it requires leaving up so much mana that it's very practical. Cards like Blossoming Defense that save a single threat from a spot removal are far easier to actually use, and are therefore more heavily played. All of this changes in Commander. Fogs are much better in Commander, as players will usually use a card like the previously mentioned Triumph of the Hordes or Cater of Behemoth to try and push for lethal. So using a Fog effect is more of an even trade. Additionally, being able to save you for most combos is a way better feature, as there are no sideboards in Commander, so you can't tailor your deck to deal with a specific combo. A card that can save you from a bunch of different combos goes way up in value in a situation like that. And since Wraths are way more common, having a way to answer them is better too. With all this in mind, it's not a surprise that this card was tailor-made for the format. However, as good as Teferi's Protection is, there is one Commander staple that's even better, and still not very good in other formats. And all the way at number 1, we have Dockside Extortionist. This is a 1/2 Goblin Pirate with a mana cost of 1 and 1 red, with the ability where, when it enters the battlefield, for each artifact and enchantment your opponent controls, you create a treasure token. These are artifacts that you can tap and sacrifice to add 1 mana of any color. This card is pretty infamous in Commander circles, with some players even asking for the card to be banned in the format. Before we get to that, we should go over why Dockside isn't good in formats like Legacy and Vintage. In Legacy, artifacts and enchantments are kind of rare, so you can't count on your opponent having them. That means that you would need to sideboard the card. But if you're going to bring a card in from the sideboard to punish artifact decks, why not bring in a card like Stone Silence that turns off all artifacts' activated abilities, or even a card like Serenity, which destroys all artifacts and enchantments during your upkeep. If you want to punish these decks, there are cards that are more practical, as the 3 or 4 mana the card will give you won't be enough to win you the game or anything. The same is largely true for Vintage, though artifacts are much more heavily played in that format. In Commander, however, things change. Artifact ramp is played in almost every deck, so Dockside will always give you value. Additionally, cards like Stony Silence and Serenity aren't anywhere near as game-winning as they are in other formats. You can't just shut down your opponent for a few turns and try to win through combat in Commander, as your opponents simply have too much life. Additionally, the extra mana Dockside will give you in that format, closer to 6 or 7 on average cast, is way more useful. This is usually more than enough mana to put a combo together, or at least an imposing board state. This isn't even getting into the multiple ways to use this mana to loot Dockside and make infinite mana, with cards like the previously mentioned Timur Sabertooth. This has made Dockside such a staple in the format that not a single red deck that's trying to win doesn't play the combo. Dockside is one of the best cards in the entire format, and yet still isn't just good anywhere but Commander. Alright, and that's the list. I know there are tons of possible candidates for this list, so share your favorites down in the comments below. Also, if you have any ideas for future videos, you can also leave those down there as well. Commander is a very different format from the rest of Magic. Being a multiplayer format with a higher starting life total and a higher deck size means that tons of effects just aren't anywhere near as useful as they are in other formats. This means that lots of cards that are staples in Magic are pretty bad in Commander. So today, we're going to go over the staples that translate into the format that works. Starting us off at number 10, we have Jace, the Mind Sculptor. This is a Planeswalker with a mana cost of 2 and 2 blue, and has a starting loyalty of 3. You can +2 it in order to look at the top card of a player's library, and then put it on the top or bottom of that player's library. You can 0 him to draw 3 cards, then put 2 cards from your hand on the top of your deck. You can -1 him to bounce a target creature, and you can -12 him to exile all cards from the target player's library, then have them shuffle their hand into the library. For anyone who's a little bit confused about Planeswalkers, let's go over them real quick, because it's actually important for explaining why Jace is on this list. A Planeswalker loyalty is like their life total. Their plus abilities give them loyalty, and their minus abilities cost them loyalty. They can be attacked like players. Also, you can activate one of the loyalty abilities once per turn, so if you have 0 Jace, you can't +2 him or -1 him that turn, or 0 him again. So, Planeswalkers like Jace can get you a lot of value if they stick at the battlefield, but are weak to things like creatures who can simply attack with it. Jace is a really strong Planeswalker, able to get you tons of card advantage if he sticks around. The key phrase being, if he sticks around. As any Commander player will tell you, Planeswalkers are significantly worse than the format. Having multiple opponents that can attack your Planeswalkers makes them very fragile. Most of the time, your Planeswalker will activate one ability and then have to pass turn, only for them to get attacked to death by 3 of your opponent's consecutive turns. Jace is here representing the vast majority of Planeswalkers, as they all suffer from the same problem, and Jace is pretty famous for being a strong walker. There are a few Planeswalkers that have escaped this issue, however. Dak Faden has a -2 to steal an artifact on a 3-mana Planeswalker. This is just a great rate for the effect of stealing an artifact, so people play him and immediately steal something, and not really care if he dies afterwards. Hugin the Spear Dragon and Elspeth's Sun Champion both have minuses that can wipe the board, making it unlikely for them to die in the following turn cycles, as there just aren't too many creatures to attack them anyway. Still, the vast majority of Planeswalkers don't see play in the format for this exact reason, so Jace finds his way onto this list. And at number 9, we have Engineered Explosives. This is an artifact with a mana cost of X, meaning any amount of mana. It has Sunburst, meaning it enters the battlefield with a number of charge counters equal to the number of colors of mana spent to cast it, and you can pay 2 and sacrifice explosives to destroy each non-land permanent with a mana value equal to the number of charge counters on explosives. Explosives is a staple sideboard card in multiple formats. Its ability to wipe the board of every card with a mana value of choice is extremely strong, as you can easily get a ton of card advantage in tempo by getting rid of a huge investment from your opponent without touching any of their counters. Explosives is mostly used to punish decks that can withstand more with tons of cards. Decks like Hammer Time use tons of one-mana cards to accomplish their gameplay, so a single explosives can have a huge impact on the game. However, explosives lose a lot of value in Commander. Commander is a format focused on a lot more expensive cards, with way more 4, 5, 6, and 7 mana. Few cards on most boards, but it's very hard to get that kind of swing.